Mom, tell me, how did Garret Mor come to power? How did he become the Earl of Kildare?
Most of the English had gone back to England, and there were three powerful Anglo-Irish lords left in Ireland. There were the Earl of Desmond in Munster, and the Earl of Kildare up around Dublin, and the Earl of Ormond. Now, the Earl of Desmond, who was related to the Fitzgeralds, there were Fitzgeralds as well, had withdrawn from the Irish lordship, and the Lord of Ormond had gone over to live in England.
And why had the Earl of Desmond withdrawn?
One of their ancestors had been executed by the English crown, and they took umbrage at that.
Yeah, fair enough. Right, okay, so go on then.
So
we've only Kildare left.
The England were not able to maintain their rule in Ireland. They only ruled in the Pale. So they got.
And where in Ireland was the Pale?
The Pale was the land around Dublin.
Okay.
Now, at this stage, it wasn't a Pale yet. It became called a Pale when they built a fence around it. And Pale is another word for fence. The Earl of Kildare, the 8th Earl of Kildare, became the 8th Earl of Kildare after his father died. But Edward IV in England, England were in the grip of the War of the Roses. They were the Yorkists against the Lancasters, and Kildare was the Yorkists. But in the Battle of Bosworth, it was the Lancasters who won out. He became the 8th Earl of Kildare, and he took over Lord Deputy. But Edward IV in England did not want to confirm him. He wanted an Englishman. He thought an Englishman would be better to do that job. So he sent over Lord Grey. But the other Anglo-Irish nobles took umbrage at this, and they wouldn't serve. They set up their own parliament, and they would not obey Lord Grey. So Lord Grey was recalled, and Henry VIII, who defeated the Yorkists at the Battle of Bosworth, confirmed that Kildare would be the Lord Deputy, even though Kildare was a Yorkist and would have been against the Tudors.
Okay, so that's how he sort of became the Earl of Kildare. How did he gain so much power in Ireland?
Well, his land, gained power from his land, from his marriage alliances, and from his position as Lord Deputy. His land was very fortuitously built around the Pale, and if he wanted to keep the Pale safe, he stopped the wild Irish, as they called them, the native Irish, from raiding the Pale. The native Irish thought it was a great thing to raid cattle and bring it back home to themselves. So, but Lord Kildare could stop them. He had a small army to himself of 120 men, and he could stop them. But if he was out with the king, he let the wild Irish invade the Pale. So his land acted as a buffer zone. Also, he took over a lot of the land that was left by the Geraldines. So he had a lot of land and in a good position.
And if you had land, did money come with that?
Well, oh yes, of course. Your tenants had to pay you so much rent. But what he did was he collected taxes for the English government. And some of these sub-chieftains had to give him money. They had to give him certain things, and the Gaelic lords gave him money, and he kept some of the money. But he could tax it. Having land, he could let it out to tenants and tax it. But his position was, he also had great power because he had 13 children, presumably not by the same woman, but they were intermarried to all the influential families in Ireland. They were all related to Garret Mor. And he then, as Lord Deputy, he could hold Parliament. Not always in Dublin, but he could hold Parliament, and he could appoint his own people as the officials for England. So that gave him great power.
And if he appointed officials, were there like elections every year, or were they like positions for life sort of thing?
There were no elections.
So it was just whoever he wanted.
He was the man who could, in these days, the king could say off with his head. There wasn't elections. We're not in a democracy at all. This is closer, just like the feudal system, where you had to be submissive to your earl.
Okay, and so how was he loyal to the king? How was his relationship with Henry VIII?
Henry VII quite enjoyed him.
Oh, he's Henry VII, yeah.
He's Henry VII. He quite enjoyed him, and he used to call him over. He was very, the great earl was very cheeky, and he said to King Henry VII. They said to him, all of Ireland couldn't rule this man. He'll do what he wants himself. So the king laughed and said, well then let this man rule all of Ireland. So he got on quite well. When he was called over, he came back married to the king's cousin. I don't know if his marriages, when he was called over for complaints. When they complained about him, he dismissed it. So he got on quite well with Henry VII. And Henry VII, as long as he was keeping the land quiet and ruling it, Henry VII was quite happy with him.
And did the weakness of the crown feed into this?
Yes, the crown was weak. That was another one of those. I should have my mnemonic here. Stop that a minute now, and I do.
And the weakness of the crown, that was because they were still recovering from the War of the Roses and the Tudors had just taken over. Is that sort of correct?
That's right. They were torn apart by the War of the Roses. Henry VII was a good king, got money, and was busy setting up his claim on the throne of England. He married Elizabeth of York, and he was too busy, as I say, settling down his own mighty nobles.
But there were ramifications from the War of the Roses that affected Garret Mor's relationship with Henry VII, wasn't there?
As I said, the Yorkists, Henry VII had a very poor claim on the crown, very, very tenuous. So the Yorkists wanted to get back. Now, at least his son, Henry VIII, was the son of Elizabeth of York. But the Yorkists wanted to get back their place in the crown. And they sent over a young prince called Lambert Simnel, who was 11 years old. And in the time of Richard, the Duke of York, who had taken over the position of the king before Richard III, the heir to the throne, the Yorkist heir to the throne, had disappeared. They'd been put into the tower, and they disappeared. To this day, it's not known what exactly happened to him. But late in the 20th century, they found bodies of two boys in the tower. So it was always attributed that Richard III killed them. But of course, Henry VII was the victor, and the victor writes history. It is much more likely that it was Henry VII had him killed. He was more a threat to Henry VII. But that's a mystery of history. But this Lambert Simnel came over to Ireland.
And did he, am I right in thinking, was it Lambert Simnel, did he land in Cork?
No, that was Garret Mor.
Oh, okay. So he came over to Ireland anyway.
He came over to Ireland with credentials. They thought they had no WhatsApp or anything like that, or photograph or anything. They thought his manners were so good that he looked like the king. And somebody said, yeah, he's the king. He looks like him. But he'd been trained up to act this. He was a hoax. But the great Earl did not accepted him as the rightful owner, the rightful heir to the English throne. And
Sorry, can I just clarify that? Did you say that the Earl Garret Mor, that he accepted Lambert Simnel as the rightful heir to the English throne?
He did more than accept him. He crowned him king in the abbey in Dublin. And this shows what powers he had to do this. This is why they took the kingship. They call themselves kings of Ireland.
And so if he crowned Lambert Simnel king in the abbey in Dublin, does that mean technically that England had two kings for a little while?
I don't think so. I don't think Ireland had the right to crown the English king. He just took it, but he could have made a king of Ireland, I suppose. We don't know what happened.
Do you know what he called him when he crowned him the king?
No.
Okay.
No. Just know he crowned him king. I presume... I'd have to
so I had read something somewhere that he named him like that when... Was it Henry's son became Edward the Sixth or something, but he'd skipped a number because of the Lambert Simnel crowning. Anyway, I'll check that out further. Go on.
I don't imagine that the Tudors would call many. They did call one of the sons Edward. Edward, the Henry VIII's son was called Edward. I can't remember what number he had on him. Anyway, he crowned him king, and the supporters, the Yorkist supporters, came over with him, and they went over to fight Henry, but Henry defeated them. And Henry sent over Lord Edgecombe to take, and Lord Edgecombe said to Garret Mor, you have to submit to the king on the forfeiture of your land. And he said, I will do no such. I will not submit under those grounds. Now, showing how powerful he was, he delayed even meeting with Edgecombe. So eventually he said to him, all right, I'll take a simple oath of loyalty. And Ireland, if Ireland didn't have the Earl of Kildare keeping control, it descended into chaos. So he was soon made, again, he was made the Earl of Kildare and the Lord Deputy. He took it over. But later on, Lambert Simnel was exposed as a hoax, and he was put serving the kitchen because he was so young. He was put serving the kitchen when Garret, the Fitzgeralds went over, and they were being feasted at the king's table. To humiliate them, they had this king, Lambert Simnel, serve them. That was considered a great humiliation of them. But the next pretender, they were called pretenders to the throne, the next pretender was Perkin Warbeck, and he was older. And Perkin Warbeck landed in Cork. Now, he was more canny this time. He did not declare him the king. There's more the Desmonds and those that surrounded Perkin Warbeck.
He sort of took no side, didn't he? Kind of stood back a bit.
But he still was blamed. They sent over Poynings. Poynings was a great friend of the king, and he sent Poynings over. And Poynings claimed that the Earl of Kildare was plotting with O'Hanlon to have him murdered. But anyway, the important thing about Poynings passed a law. And that is the important thing that started the breaking of the power of the Kildares. Because now Poynings' law said that no legislation could be passed in Ireland without pre-knowledge of England and without English consent. And also all laws passed in England applied in Ireland. So Poynings' law was the beginning of the Tudor conquest of Ireland.
And did Poynings' law, did that also change the appointments to the government? Do they have to be sanctioned now by the king under Poynings' law, whereas before Garret Mor could?
It didn't say it in his law, but that's what happened in fact. But Henry VIII came along, and Henry VIII decided he needed Ireland to be obeying him and not to be faithful to the Pope. at that stage, in Garret Oak's time, the officials in Dublin Castle were Englishmen, English officials that hated them. Like,
So is there anything else sort of significant about Garret Mor's time in office? So we had the two pretenders, Lambert Simnel, who he crowned king. We had Perkin Warbeck, who he didn't really support but didn't unsupport. And we had Poynings, who came over, and Poynings' law was introduced. Was there anything else of sort of significance?
He was at the height of his power when he defeated the MacBurks at Knocktoe. And some history said that was the first time a gun was used in Irish war. But that was him at the height of his power. He'd I forgot to say that one stage of his power was he interfered with the Gaelic chiefs' custom of he went in when they were and got his man to be named their chief, and he interfered in their laws, but they were also obedient to him. In their customs as to who would be the chief, he had his man be nominated for the chief of the Irish kingdoms, so that they were all obeying him, both the Irish chieftains and the Anglo-Irish chieftains. This was before now the break in the religion. They were all the one religion at this stage.
Okay, so that's a quick synopsis of Garret Mor.